celibacy of its priests. And we're all aware, I think, of many arguments against that. I'm just going to go through some of them, then explain the Church's position, and answer some of these objections at the end. So what are the objections? Well, the first one that we get from our Protestant friends is that it's not scriptural. They say it's not contained in Revelation. It has no place in the history of the early history of the Church. The apostles were married, the early priests in the early Church were married, so why is the Latin Church insisting on this? They also say that it's a cause of disunity, that the Orthodox are married, the Protestant priests are married. By forbidding this in the Catholic Church, you are creating division between us and the other Christians. Also, we hear that imposing celibacy is a violation of a fundamental human right of the person, which is to marry. And also we hear that lifting the ban on marriage for priests would solve the apparent shortage of priests. We also hear that it leads to isolation. Some people would say even to homosexuality, some of the problems of pedophilia, people that we've seen in the past years. People would lay that at the floor of, attribute that to the fact that priests are celibate or have to be celibate. And they also say that a married clergy would be more in tune with the people. If you're married, you can understand a married person better and giving spiritual direction to him. So let's first of all define our terms. Celibacy means the renunciation of marriage. So one who is celibate is one who has renounced marriage. He's not married. Continence means the renunciation of sexual relations. A married couple can choose to live continence for a period of time. So the idea of, and someone can choose continence for his whole life. So continence, celibacy implies continence. According to the Church's teaching, if a person is celibate, he should not engage in sexual relations with anyone. But continence does not always imply that somebody is not married. Virginity is the renunciation of sexual relations for one's whole life. So a man or a woman who makes a commitment to celibacy, to virginity for their whole life, or to continence for their whole life, is going to remain a virgin. And chastity is a virtue. Chastity is a virtue which leads one to use one's sexual drive in accordance with God's law and the teachings of the Church. It's, in other words, to use that exclusively in marriage and for the always open to life. And so it's a virtue that is lived by everyone. It's called to be lived by everyone. Single or married or widow, or priest or laity, everyone is called to live chastity. But not everyone is called, of course, to celibacy or continence or virginity. So first of all, it's well known, just to get our facts straight, it's well known that in the early Church, priests, or up until modern times, priests have never been allowed to marry. And the issue was ordaining men who were already married. So everyone understood this, and everyone understands it today, that never, once someone was ordained, he was not allowed to get married. But most of the priests in the early churches, we'll see, were in fact married when they were ordained. So one of the arguments against celibacy is that it's not contained in Revelation, it was not practiced in the early church. It's argued that in the East, they've kept this tradition, and so they still allow married priests, whereas the Western Church has arbitrarily imposed celibacy, that it is of purely ecclesiastical origin, and the Church instituted this or invented it. It wasn't something that came from Christ or from the apostles. Now it's worth noting that the Church has never admitted this. In the Council of Trent, it was debated because the Protestants were allowing a married clergy, and the Council Fathers refused to state that clerical celibacy or clerical continence was of purely ecclesiastical origin. So it's clearly not of the essence of the sacrament, of course. A married man can be validly ordained, at least in terms of the essence of the sacrament, even though now it's in the Western Church, a priest who tries to get married, the marriage will be invalid, but it's not of the essence of the sacrament. For many years, married men were being ordained. So up to what point did our Lord and the apostles teach that it's more suitable for a priest to be celibate or continent? And although it can't be proven beyond all doubt, the most likely scenario is that from apostolic times, ordained ministers, including the apostles, were bound to live continence from the moment of their ordination on. So even though they were married, they and their wife consented to live continence from that moment until the end of their lives. So that's the most likely scenario. Where does that come from? We'll go through that. In the year 305, in the early 4th century, in Elvira, Spain, this little town near Granada, there was a provincial council that was held, Council of Spanish Bishops. And in Canon 33 of that council, we read the following: "We forbid bishops, priests, and deacons to have sexual relations with their wives and to procreate children. Should anyone do so, let him be excluded from the honor of the clergy." So the first point is that yes, most priests seem to have been married. They say priests should not have sexual relations with their wives. And that was the case not only in Spain, but throughout the church. Most people who were being ordained were married people. Priests were chosen from among men who had been married for some years. You know, that early term for priest, the Greek word is elder. That's the person who was older, not very old, but he had shown that his sense of responsibility, he'd been able to raise a family and live order in his household over a number of years. That showed that he was responsible enough to be a priest. So most priests were chosen from among older men who'd been married, for some years, not necessarily older, who had shown that they could manage their household. St. Paul also says that he has to be married but once. And in the minds of St. Paul and in the early church fathers in the church, that was proof of an ability to live continence. If a man's wife had married and he had seen the need to remarry, it was a sign that he might not be able to live continence as a priest, and so he was not going to be ordained. So remarried widowers were not ordained in the early church. Now the aim of this council, the stated aim of the council, was to reaffirm the teachings of the discipline of the church. So Canon 33 was not presented as a new law. If it had been a new law, it would have raised a storm of protest, as you can imagine. If all the priests were having such relations with their wives, and all of a sudden the church says no, you would have had a big debate about this. There was no debate. What was new was the sanction. He should be excluded from the honor of the clergy. He would no longer be able to practice as a priest if he continued having such relations with his wife. So what we have here is a problem that is going to plague the church throughout the Middle Ages, is that on the one hand you have the law on the books, but it's not being lived. And whenever you see in church councils a law being issued again and again and again, there's only one reason for that. It's because it's not being lived. And so the church has to insist again and again. This is what happened with clerical continence, that priests were not living it, and so it's an issue right through the Middle Ages in the different church councils. So continence was simply not being lived by many of the clergy, in spite of their commitment to do so, and so the church had to put this sanction in there to warn them. 20 years later, the Council of Nicaea is an ecumenical council, the first ecumenical council of the church. It takes for granted in its legislation that clerics will be continent. And it listed the women who could live in the home of a priest. It says his mother could live there, his sister, his aunt, or it says any other woman who was free from suspicion. And that was interpreted to mean a wife who had committed herself to continence with her husband. So she could only stay there if the commitment had been made. And so by all, and this is repeated, and by all the different councils in the East and in the West, that the priest has to live continence from the moment of his ordination on. In the year 390, there's a council in Carthage in North Africa. It states that bishops, priests, and deacons have to live perfect continence from the moment of their ordination. It also said that this was taught by the apostles. So it brings it right back to apostolic times. And that it had been lived from the beginning of the church, that it originated with the apostles. So that is the Council of Carthage in the year 390, stating this unequivocally. In the year 385 and 386, after a synod in Rome, the Pope Siricius, he issued some decretals interpreting the Pauline text of a man being, you could only ordain someone who was a husband of one wife, to mean that this is a test of continence. That if he has seen the need to remarry, he must not be ordained because it's a sign that he might not be able to live this continence.